taking a critical look at white allyship and the rise of Slacktivism. But before I begin, I can tell you all a little bit about myself. I'm a senior philosophy student here at Cal Poly with a minor in ethics, public policy, science, and technology. And I've been involved in different local campaigns throughout my time at college. And last summer, I started working with California Public Interest Research Group, where I continue to work towards social justice and environmental justice by lobbying, petition gathering, and canvassing. And just before we begin, I want to be clear that I have definitely engaged in slacktivism, and by no means do I think it should be abandoned altogether. My goal is to get the conversation started with you all today about the impact of digital campaigns in hopes that everyone will have a better idea of how to be an effective ally. So here you can see a quick overview of what we'll be going through today. But before we jump into everything, I want to start by posing a quick question to you all today. So if you could take a minute to fill out this survey that should show up in the chat, you can click that link or you can scan the QR code on the screen here. And I'll let everyone have just a second to get that done. I'll be monitoring those responses. And that question is, how long does it usually take you to give up on New Year's resolutions? So, okay, we have some responses coming in. Okay, so it looks like almost all of you are indicating that you tend to give up on resolutions after a couple of months. And this is actually not too different from what I want to talk to you guys about slacktivism today and the effect that white allies can get from engaging in slacktivism. So a study published in Scientific American actually showed that users who publicly declare or post their resolutions on social media are more likely to fail. And that's because the act of publicly declaring your goals gives our brains enough satisfaction to where we don't feel like we even need to follow through. So I just want you guys to keep this in mind as I go through the next few minutes, because this is similar to the way that slacktivism can seem fulfilling to its participants. So I'm going to go over a brief explanation. If you're not already familiar with the term, slacktivism refers to the act of supporting a social or political movement by engaging with related content on social media platforms and necessarily involving very little effort on the part of the participant. This can take the form of reposting infographics, denoting political affiliation in your profile, or even just using a hashtag like #MeToo or #BlackLivesMatter. But some scholars even cite political bumper stickers or t-shirts as some early forms of slacktivism pre-internet. But slacktivism is often well-intentioned, but as I'm gonna show you guys today, it's actually quite problematic when examining larger scale effects on the social movements that it aims to support. So I have a quick graph here from Pew University, Pew Research Center, that shows that about half of Americans have engaged in digital participation. And I think that makes it super relevant for our talk today. So as the internet became a more accessible agent for social connection and communication in general around the turn of the century, it would inevitably become a platform to discuss and promote contemporary social issues. The exact origin of the term slacktivism is debated, but Dwight Ozard and Fred Clark take credit for its first use at a music festival in 1995, and where it was originally used to describe bottom-up activities by young people to affect society on a small personal level. But like I said, its modern definition has evolved into a slightly different idea of digital political participation with a more negative connotation. So why is it a problem? On many levels, digital activism can seem like an optimal way to reach audiences, but critics of digital activism who push the slacktivism narrative argue that it can often water down or delegitimize the social movement that it appears to promote, and also propel hegemony and overall set the wrong standards for advocacy and civic engagement. A common defense of slacktivism, though, revolves around its unmatched ability to spread awareness on a huge scale. And this point is valid. I mean, there's definitely something to be said for raising awareness, but it becomes an issue when the larger scale effects of slacktivism create a digital culture that normalizes spreading awareness as the only necessary step. So white activism and the awareness myth is something I'll touch on more deeply later on. But essentially, popular participation in digital activism encourages bad activism habits that contrarily still results in that satisfaction on the part of the participant, even though in reality their contribution was pretty minimal or surface level, like reposting or hashtagging. So they don't feel like anything more is required on their part. And this encourages that kind of one and done attitude towards activism that ends up hindering the social movements. So why is Slacktivism relevant? The reason that I found the topic of digital activism to be so timely in a modern discussion of social justice is because the COVID-19 pandemic has forced all of us to turn to the internet to do everything. So throughout our time together today, I want to explore the ramifications of political movements' reliance on social media and the potential consequences and benefits of activist efforts becoming digitized by a pandemic or by any other means. So now, social movements that have historically relied on in-person methods of advocacy have been forced to turn to the internet to carry on the bulk of their pursuits in light of COVID. Looking at 2020 in particular, there were many pivotal moments that resulted in huge spikes in advocacy. One of the most notable being the heightened buzz around Black Lives Matter. And in this case, we saw a huge surge of public displays of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black community in general following the killing of George Floyd. And I'll be coming back to Black Lives Matter as kind of a case study so that we can frame our discussion around a real ongoing movement. But for now, it's important to note that the American public does hold very diverse views on social media as an agent for political change, excuse me. And the lack of consensus there on Slacktivism as an effective means for change speaks directly to the disparity between potential dangers and potential benefits of social media as a catalyst. Um, so next, I want to introduce the notion of white activism and its place in racial justice movements, as well as just its interrelatedness with Slacktivism as a whole. So with the paradigm shift that we see brought about by the birth of internet culture, Slacktivism became more widely spread. And nowadays, it's so deeply embedded in social media use that it's become self-perpetuating. And this is especially true in regards to white activism and subsequent designations of allyship. So in this day and age, many young people, myself included, first engage in activism, and I'm using this word in a loose sense, through social media. And this phenomenon is a function of white privilege that underlies so many of our societal institutions, and that white adolescents are not usually forced to confront systemic injustice in the real world. Instead, they can choose to participate in popular digital movements that address those injustices at their own leisure and convenience by, reposting an infographic or using a hashtag and still feeling pretty satisfied with their contributions. And the volume of this kind of social media interaction perpetuates itself by encouraging more social media users, especially white users, to adopt those same etiquettes of hashtagging and sharing. So the very option to engage in activism on platforms like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook encourages its own diffusion and perpetuates the white myth that systemic injustices can be solved through efforts to spread awareness alone. So when younger white social media users first come into contact with what they think is activism on Instagram or Twitter, and they see influencers getting praised for their wokeness when they engage in it, it sets unspoken guidelines for how to approach participation in social movements. And the problem here is that Instagram posts don't usually go beyond spreading awareness, which is not a solution to injustice, but rather one of the many tools that we should use in fighting it. And there's also the issue of racism built into many social media apps. So many Black influencers and anti-racism pages have reported being shadow banned or censored by Instagram if their content is especially controversial or calls out white supremacy, leading it to be reported by defensive viewers. So, for example, Monique Melton, who is a popular Black Instagram educator, claims that her anti-racism posts, which discuss important topics like white supremacy, have gotten removed and flagged as hate speech after being reported by users who disapprove of her content. And this is a quote from Melton saying, they absolutely have to have some type of appeal process, some way to contest your content being removed. And it's not just an automatic thing that happens because a white person doesn't like hearing about racism. There needs to be an anti-racism policy that protects activists and Black creators who are writing on these topics. Just because I write the words white supremacy should not flag my account as hate speech. So now I want to jump back and dive a little bit deeper into the problems related to goals of spreading awareness and slacktivism as a catalyst to white allyship. So slacktivism by nature is aimed more towards spreading information through social media rather than engaging with the offline world. And there are some exceptions to this, such as distribution of useful resources like petitions or phone numbers, which encourage more active participation, but even those posts can't be effective without first achieving visibility. On his blog post, Stuff White People Like, writer Christian Lander argues that white slacktivists tend to consider spreading awareness of injustice a movement's ends rather than its means of going on to achieve tangible policy change. And in his view, white people believe and perpetuate the myth that injustices that face marginalized groups can be solved through awareness alone. And this is a mindset that allows for white slacktivists to continue to achieve that satisfaction from superficial displays of support, keyword there being displays. And the process spreads very quickly as many social media users will develop the wrong connotation of activism. So as something that is essentially defined by spreading awareness, you can see how slacktivism would be limited by these concerns surrounding the awareness myth. Okay, so as white activism habits become the norm, more and more young white people who resonate with a movement like Black Lives Matter are calling themselves allies. And here we see the term ally evolving into one that signifies a person's feelings toward a movement instead of signifying a person who has put in consistent work outside of social media for the sake of that movement. Many white users who engage in slacktivism have started to self-identify as allies, and by that, they're further contributing to the deterioration of the ally label. In her article called Unsettling Allyship, Unlearning and Learning Towards Decolonizing Solidarity, author Jenny Klutz addresses these misconceptions around the notion of allyship and how its modern misuse encourages what she refers to as the colonization of solidarity. One of her central points is that white allyship is always motivated by personal self-interest, at least in part. So even if the goal of white allies is the same as those who are marginalized, it's likely for different reasons. And this self-interest is inherent to white allyship, but it becomes especially dangerous when marginalized perspectives are being exploited by allies who fail to first go out of their way to construct foundational relationships or dialogues with those marginalized communities. And this sort of occurrence demonstrates the tendency for modern allyship to center whiteness around the conversation instead of uplifting marginalized voices that are at the heart of the movement, whether that's inadvertent or not. So Klutz argues that for this reason, white people cannot self-identify as allies. And that label really should come from a member of the marginalized group whom a movement focuses around. And this makes complete sense. I mean, as much as you might want to communicate your support of a social justice movement, you are not the one that should be getting to decide that you've effectively demonstrated that support. Klutz also holds that ally is not a permanent designation. It should imply continued efforts towards a cause. And with this point, she wants to avoid that kind of one and done mindset that we do unfortunately see present in popularized digital activism today. So allyship does not translate across movements. And this is another one of Klutz's points. So an ally to Black Lives Matter, for example, is not by proxy considered an ally of LGBTQ plus liberation. True allyship, which is defined by demonstrated solidarity and significant effort, Klutz says should involve recognizing the importance of marginalized narratives and continued efforts to the cause without the recentering of whiteness. And her central point throughout this whole article is that social movements really do require a moral commitment from allies to understand and analyze the working systems that create the need for the movements in the first place. And doing so includes a white ally's own part in sustaining and benefiting from those structures. So many of her points are super important in understanding the false notion of allyship that we see popular on social media today. Modern use of ally can be effective in signifying political alignment or your personal values, but white people awarding allyship to themselves is inherently performative or superficial if it's done so without having put in the necessary work towards a movement. And I think that this is something that is just not really realized by many well-intentioned social media users. And this ties back to how self-perpetuating trends among white activism really are. So common uses of ally today don't indicate any substantial contribution and are often used for clout so that white creators seem woke and seem informed. And this is something that I saw a lot of during the 2020 surge of Black Lives Matter content on social media. And this is understandable. When you're actively seeing things that are upsetting, like police brutality, it's natural to want to speak out about it and show your support. And my goal here is not to imply that doing or saying nothing would be better than reposting or spreading awareness. But this is a really hard topic, and I don't have all the answers here, but I am hoping to get the conversation started. So next, I want to come back to the 2020 hyper focus on Black Lives Matter as kind of a case study of Slacktivism and of white allyship. So following the tragic deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and especially George Floyd, internet users around the world used social media to express their outrage, their grief, and their solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And throughout June of 2020, which was amid the pandemic, Black Lives Matter content was all over social media. There seemed to be kind of a shift, and we collectively made space for Black Lives Matter content and the voices of Black creators in general. And over the next few minutes, I want to more critically analyze this influx of Black Lives Matter hashtagging and reposting that flooded through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok all throughout last summer. And I want to pay special attention to white activism and white allyship during that time and how performative elements may have impacted the movement. So I think that one of the most notable exhibitions of the social media buzz around BLM after George Floyd was killed was the extremely popular sub campaign, hashtag Blackout Tuesday on Instagram. So this trend, if you're unfamiliar, was started by Atlanta Records music executives Brianna Ajimang and Jamila Thomas as a spin-off of their original initiative, which was hashtag The Show Must Be Paused. And that initiative encouraged the music industry to uplift Black artists and speak out about institutionalized racism. Here you can see a statement from Ajimang and Thomas, which reads, "Our mission is to hold the industry at large, including major corporations and their partners who benefit from the efforts, struggles, and successes of Black people accountable. It is the obligation of these entities to protect and empower the Black communities that have made them disproportionately wealthy in ways that are measurable and transparent." So as the hashtag gained traction, it was actually social media users who began calling the day Blackout Tuesday. This was June 2nd, and posted the hashtag Blackout Tuesday under a plain black square on Instagram. And the movement completely took off. The hashtag now has over 20 million posts on Instagram. So obviously an overwhelming show of support there from social media users all over the world. And like I said, the movement is so memorable, partly because of the volume of posts containing only that black square and hashtag. So after rolling with the movement and seeing the global support of their original campaign, Ajimang and Thomas hosted their own virtual summit, which drew almost 1,500 people from artist communities, streaming services, radio stations, talent agencies, even law firms. And participants of their summit took turns discussing the exploitation and unethical conduct within their own companies and started to pave the way for a more transparent industry. In response to the campaign, the three major record labels, Universal Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, and Warner Music Group, called off their normal operations that same day, June 2nd, and organized workshops and discussions for their employees instead. We also see big corporations stepping aside, streaming services and radio stations pivoted to highlight Black artists. Spotify, for example, added an 8-minute, 46-second track of silence in select playlists in remembrance of George Floyd. So Ajimang and Thomas have continued to work towards transparency and equity within the industry, keeping accordance with their original goal of demanding the industry to respect Black employees, Black leaders, and Black artists who they benefit from. So it is clear that a lot of good did come out of this digital campaign. And I think all of that is exemplary of the power that digital activism does have. But that doesn't mean it was not without controversy. So despite the overwhelming show of support, many Black influencers and allies expressed concerns about the influx of traffic under Black Lives Matter, which was often used in tandem with Blackout Tuesday or hashtag the show must be stopped. The campaign took place right in the middle of key in-person protests and their supplemental information spread online. So digital projects that centered around urgent goals like raising bail funds for protesters and providing protest updates in case of danger started to become misplaced amid the rush of Black squares using the same relevant hashtags. Visibility for those resources was crucial, and it was commonly found through the searchable feed under hashtag Black Lives Matter. So in addition to clogging channels for information spread, the impact of the campaign ended up kind of drowning out its purpose. And I think this really limited its impact, considering that most users who came across the movement only saw the performative displays of solidarity. So the noise to signal ratio was going way up. We see way too much noise, and the signal was getting lost in all of that. So as encouraging that those displays of support were, the initial intent of the movement, which was to make space for Black workers in the music industry, was lost. I know I didn't know that that was the original goal of the campaign until I read about it more thoroughly. So overall, I think that this mini campaign is a great example of how a movement can become watered down by being so widely distributed. On one hand, it's overwhelmingly encouraging to see just the sheer volume of social media users who used the hashtag to show support for the movement. And without that volume of participants, it's way less likely that some of the larger corporations would have stepped aside and used their platforms to make space for the Black community. But on the other hand, we do have to consider how the trend manifested on social media. The hashtag Blackout Tuesday, which, like I said, was often used accompanying hashtag Black Lives Matter, swept through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and did drown out those valuable resources like donation centers, protesting updates, and relevant petitions. So as the sub movement of BLM continued to gain traction, it became more and more unlikely that Instagram users who were unfamiliar with Ajimang's and Thomas's initial motivations would come across digestible, thought-provoking information related to their goals. And instead, all that would be seen was a Black square. So this pretty much wraps up the talking portion of what I wanted to get through today. Like I said, my goal is to start the conversation. There's obviously a ton more work that we need to do to tackle systemic racism and overall injustices. And we all want to do better. This is supposed to be a co-investigation into how we can achieve that. And there's still a lot of really hard questions surrounding Slacktivism that we are going to be difficult to answer. So I want to take our remaining time to invite you all to share your thoughts on those remaining hard questions. For one, is it better to show superficial support, which may or may not be self-serving, or to show none at all? I mean, it's pretty crucial on some level for movements to have that strength in numbers. So I want to hear from you all, and I'll stop my screen share now if anyone has thoughts about that. And I encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand in the participants window to share out loud. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start asking some of you to unmute.
So one of the things I wanted to, I guess, just talk about real quick is I feel like part of the problem with white activism and slacktivism in general is this idea of like the white savior complex, where it's an immediately, and you kind of touched on it already, but like this immediately digestible like boost of, okay, I'm doing the right thing, I'm saving these people, and it I don't know, it kind of bastardizes the movement in general and makes it about self-serving. You're seeking that, that high of feeling like you're doing the right thing and you're helping these people, when that's not really what it's supposed to be about. Like, yes, you should want to help the people, but it seems like a lot of the time with slacktivism, it's self-serving help rather than legitimate help and getting the resources known and that kind of thing, and kind of going off of that a little bit too. I know of a man named Gayatri Spivak who talks about, can the subaltern speak? and the subaltern being like these communities that have problems that are legitimate, but then you have this rise of white people or people who are quote unquote more powerful because of our society, and those people who are more powerful making it again more about themselves than the actual issue, and then trying to say that their voice, what they're vocalizing about the community, is more valuable than what the community is actually saying that it needs. You know?
That's a great point. And I think that ties back into Jenny Lee Klutz's argument that all white activism is on some level inherently self-serving. And that's pretty hard to digest. As a white person, I've tried to deal with that myself. But Kane, and I hope I'm saying your name right, I think that's a great point to bring up, because the white savior complex overall is something that has a real negative impact on movements. And I think it just speaks to the importance of needing to analyze the actual effects that your actions are having. If anyone else has thoughts, I'm super curious to hear what you guys think. Like I said, we all want to make this a better place, and SLO specifically is very much white populated. And I think, we do need that collective effort if we want to see tangible change. I mean, in Letter from Birmingham Jail, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, Dr. Martin Luther King warned about the danger of the white moderate and claimed that these people were even more dangerous to Black liberation than the KKK, because they perpetuated hate culture, kind of the silent majority notion. So maybe on one hand, it's advantageous to have white activists, white Slacktivists speaking out. I mean, maybe it's better than saying nothing. Does anyone have thoughts?
I just had like another question. I was kind of wondering what your opinion was on like a potential connection between online activism and like substantial policy work on like either a state or a national level.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because at least speaking for myself, I think that the presence of information spread related to social justice movements on, very accessible platforms like Instagram really contributed to myself pursuing to become more knowledgeable on that. And I think that I would like to assume that at this point I have, gone beyond Slacktivism a little bit, just working with CalPERG and contributing to some substantial policy change. But yeah, Jamie, I think there is something to be said for Slacktivism being kind of that link between someone who maybe isn't knowledgeable, becoming more involved, and eventually becoming a real ally to the movement. But I think that the danger of Slacktivism comes when that link is not clear, and it comes when examining the effects of Slacktivism on a larger scale, where it does contribute to a culture shift where young people assume that that is the only step, that is the ends of achieving systemic justice, when instead it should be just one of many tools. That's a great question. I'm going to keep my eye on the participants window in case anyone wants to share out loud. But I'm loving everyone's contributions in the chat too. Does anyone have any? Oh, Lisa, if you want to go ahead and share.
Okay, awesome. I'm just kind of like thinking aloud here, kind of like a line that we could set for ourselves whenever we share like a piece of information, could just be saying, like spreading knowledge is important, because without knowledge, then
I think I'm losing you a little bit. I'm not sure if that's on my end. But Lisa, yeah, I would love to hear what you have to say. If you want to type it out in the chat, I'm sure it's very valuable. And I know we're at the, okay.
It can happen, but spreading why, if there's any sort of like organization that you know of that, reader.
Yeah, I would love if you could type that in the chat because I didn't hear most of what you said. But I see a question. I'm curious on what your opinion is on the next steps someone can take to move from Slacktivism to activism. So I think that is a great question. And I think that view suggests a very positive notion of what what Slacktivism can mean, because I think it can be, like I said, this first step in engagement towards real advocacy work. So I would say that someone who has maybe only participated in Slacktivism, digital activism, it already speaks that you are taking that step and acknowledging that. But I think starting those hard discussions and asking yourself what your role should be in legitimate allyship, seeking out Black voices, POC voices is so important. Like I said about recentering whiteness, we see that a lot in current, discussions of social justice, where white allies are inadvertently recentering themselves as kind of the voice of a conversation. So I would just say that, Slacktivism can be effective in being a first step. And I would just urge everyone here, if you're going to continue to participate in it, which I assume many of you are, because it's so accessible these days, is just to make sure you're seeking out the right voices, seeking out Black creators, POC creators, and seeking out elected officials' contact information so that you can start to lobby, or seeking out relevant petitions that you can start to sign, and just calling out your fellow white peers who are maybe not having those important discussions is a great place to start. Yeah, definitely, Lisa. I know we're a little bit past the time today. Oh, I see that we have some hands. So Miriam, if you want to go ahead and unmute, I'd love to hear you.
Unmute. There we go. Just one of the things that was coming up for me a little bit was remembering that time when activism was really high, and actually I do remember the Blackout Tuesday that you referred to, and that was during a time where I myself was sort of like, okay, what is the right, like, should I share information? Should I not share information? And I think sometimes, although it's very complex, it depends on what it is you're sharing and what the purpose of what you're sharing is, because I know that one of the feedbacks that wasn't necessarily feedback to me, but one of the posts that I saw from one of my friends was that sometimes if you're just sharing very graphic content over and over again, the people of that community, like it's in their face all the time. And so sometimes it doesn't necessarily really help them to see like, hey, I see that you're now aware of this, but at some point, like, it's not necessarily really helping anyone to keep sharing that same graphic information when it's not leading to anything.
Yeah, definitely super important point there, and completely exemplary in the whole Blackout Tuesday thing. I, considered that myself when I saw everything that was going on, because I didn't feel like it was super effective to share, just a plain black square. And I think that when you realize that all you're doing over and over is sharing something on your story, you have to examine, okay, why am I continuing to do this? And then there's the whole issue of social media as kind of an echo chamber. You're not really reaching new people. So I think that just ties back again to Slacktivism or digital activism being a first step and a way to kind of get your foot in the door of advocacy. But yeah, great question. Yeah, so, okay, I know that we're a couple of minutes over time, so I want to thank you guys all so much for being here today. I see all of your thoughtful insight in the chat, and I really value everyone who raised their hand and shared out loud. Again, thank you guys all so much. I hope that this will inspire you a little bit to take an extra step from just posting online, because I know that is so easy and it feels so good. But thank you everyone so much for being here today.
Yes, thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to put a quick link in the chat for a feedback form. Please fill it out. You might be entered for a giveaway, so please fill it out. We'll also be sending another feedback form for the overall conference at the end of the day, so please fill that out too. and go to the rest of the sessions today, but we all appreciate having you here. Here's the schedule for the other sessions. And again, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Olivia, for hosting and leading this discussion. And I hope you all have a beautiful day.
Yeah, bye everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.